The house sat at the edge of the land where maps turned to guesswork and even wind seemed to ask permission before passing. Its windows had no curtains, its doors hadn't creaked open for years, and its roof had gathered the kind of dust that wasn't stirred by time, but by the memory of motion itself. Inside, the woman moved without making sound, as if her footsteps had learned to float above the wooden planks to avoid disrupting the stillness. She had grown to understand not just as a condition, but as a companion. She had lived here for so long that her name no longer echoed in her own mind. There were no mirrors, no letters, no remnants of any language that might have reminded her she had once been spoken to. Every morning, she would sit by the same chair, near the west-facing wall, watching the horizon as if expecting a shape to emerge, not out of hope, but out of rhythm. The wind came at the same hour, with the same lazy fury, dragging dry twigs and whispering over the cracked clay. It's oiled like a story being told in a tongue only she remembered. The trees, what little remained of them, bent not toward the sky, but away from the house, as if even they had decided not to interrupt the silence that lived there. A car tea kettle had long lost its whistle. It boiled in silence, and she would pour without steam rising, drinking from a chipped cup with a crack, down its side like a fault line in the earth. The only visitor was the sun, and even it kept a respectful distance, touching only the corners of her window as if unsure it was still welcome. Her clothes were folded not out of need, but memory. She dusted shelves that hadn't held anything in a decade, as if honoring the ghosts of jars and books and letters that once lived there. At night, she didn't light candles. Instead, she watched the shadows do their work. They moved slowly, curling around the floor and walls, like they were practicing the shape of loneliness. No birds came near. No animals dared the still air. Even the insects seemed to move elsewhere to hum their lives in louder places. In the silence of that house, breath became the only sound, and even that she measured inhale, hold, exhale so carefully, as if noise might cause the walls to forget how to stand. This was not exile. This was a choice, a long one. The kind you make not after a single pain, but after many small ones that accumulate like dust beneath a rug that is never lifted. She had spoken once, long ago, with a voice warm and tired, and full of color, but that was before the sound meant repetition, before her words returned unanswered, before the letters stopped arriving, and names disappeared from the lips of those who once said them with certainty. She did not light fires anymore. She cooked in the heat of the sun, or not at all. She ate sparingly. The larder, though full of preserved things, remained untouched. Her hunger had shifted, grown abstract. What she waited for if she waited at. All was not a meal, not a knock, not even forgiveness. Perhaps it was simply a shift in the wind, a new dust, a different silence. She hadn't touched the front door in years. Its handle was wrapped in cloth, not out of protection, but as a ritual. Dust lay thick in its grooves, but still, she passed it every day, looked at it, nodded to it, as one would a neighbor they hadn't seen in a while. And outside, nothing ever changed. No footprints, no smoke from beyond the hills, no signal fires, no carts, no wheels. Until one night, though, that is a story for another chapter. For now, this is the quiet, the full weight of absence, the long hour before interruption. This is the life of the woman in the house that faced the dust, and the dust, as always, bowed to her first. Tell us, where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it for you? Leave a comment below so we know who's drifting with us across the dust. And if this story helps you rest, consider liking the video and subscribing for more quiet tales from forgotten places. There had always been a jug beside the door, not new, not cracked, not stained, just waiting, with the quiet patience of something that was made for use but never once fulfilled its purpose. A shape molded for motion, yet forever still, a vessel that belonged to a task that had been forgotten before it could even be remembered. She had placed it there a long time ago, maybe on a morning when the dust was light enough to let her see her own footprints, or perhaps on a day when she still thought visitors could appear not as memories but as people, breathing and warm and speaking in full sentences. And since then, it had become part of the doorway's shadow, part of the house's silence, like a sentinel watching over nothing. The sun had kissed it in every season. Snow had ignored it politely, and even the wind, which touched everything with equal carelessness, avoided tipping it over, as though it, too, knew that to disturb the jug would be to speak a name long buried. But on this day, without announcement, without any wind to carry warning, the jug moved ever so slightly, ever so deliberately, its base scraping just barely against the packed earth. And the sound, thin and real, stretched through the entire house like the first note in a song she had forgotten how to hum. She did not rise immediately, did not breathe deeply, only turned her head toward the door and blinked once, slow and heavy, like someone waking from a dream that had lasted too many winters. Outside, there was no voice, no shadow across the window pane, no echo of movement across the plain, and yet the jug, her jug, had shifted. Not toppled, not spilled, just shifted. A gesture so small it could have been missed had the silence not made every second sacred. She stood slowly, as if afraid the floorboards would protest, as if her bones might creak a warning. But everything stayed still, still as it had always been, and she stepped toward the jug, her hand brushing the frame of the door before reaching down, her fingers hovering just above its curved rim, and there, just there, she saw it, a thumbprint in the dust, fresh, soft, impossibly new, pressed into the jug's shoulder like a signature written in breath. It wasn't hers. She knew her hands, knew the shape they left, and this was smaller, rounder, not hesitant, but not bold either. The kind of touch that comes from someone testing the world to see if it responds. She did not smile, but her eyes flickered, not from fear, not from hope, but from recognition something had changed, and the jug had borne witness. She left it there, untouched, its new mark glowing faintly in the afternoon light, and stepped back into the house, pausing just inside the door, as if expecting to hear a knock, a breath, a whisper, but none came. Still, the air was different now, as if stirred from a long sleep, and even the dust, which had once been motionless as stone, seemed to rise just slightly, dancing in beams of sun that now angled themselves with purpose, as though aligning with a story beginning again. She walked to the table, poured herself tea she didn't remember brewing, and watched the door not for what might come through it, but for what had already passed it unseen. All that day she moved differently, not quickly, but not idly either. Dusting shelves she had ignored for months, setting a second cup on the table without realizing she had done so, and humming softly, without melody, like wind through reeds, until night fell and the jug, still outside, kept its new secret beneath a sky that looked just a little closer than it had the day before. The wind had always been the only visitor, the only companion that dared cross the invisible boundary between the dry plain and the quiet house. A soundless traveler that carried no messages, offered no warmth, brought no footprints, only the thin sighs of forgotten skies and the scent of far-off dust. And for years it had come and gone with the same indifference, brushing the windows like a memory not worth keeping, weaving between the wooden beams like a ghost with no story to tell, never staying long enough to notice, never loud enough to demand attention. But that evening, something shifted, something subtle and profound, as if the wind had decided, for the first time in countless evenings, that it no longer wanted to be alone. She noticed it not in the way it howled or pressed against the walls, but in the way it carried weight, an unfamiliar drag in its current, as though tethered to fabric, to movement, to things that weren't supposed to exist out there, things like cloth stretched over poles, like footsteps softly tamping down the earth, like breath warming the cold seams of canvas. She stepped out as the sun sank behind the horizon, and the wind greeted her not as it always had, not as a passing whisper, but as a messenger returning from some far place, and in its voice was a rustle, a rhythm, a texture that did not belong to sky or dust, but to hands, to people, to presence. She followed the sound with her eyes, scanning the ridges where shadows gathered. And then she saw them not clearly, not fully, but enough to know she was not imagining. 8 tents, small and low, pitched at the edge of where the horizon began. To rise, their outlines trembling slightly in the wind, as if unsure they had the right to be there. No fire was lit, no figures stood guard, but the tents breathed with life, silent and certain, like punctuation marks in a sentence she had forgotten how to read. The wind wove around them, not through them, and as it circled back toward her, how she felt it brush her skin differently, more deliberately, as if trying to pull her toward the presence it now carried with pride. She did not move closer, not yet, but she stood a little longer than usual outside the door, her eyes fixed on the soft rise and fall of canvas far away, and as the wind wrapped around her hair, her shoulders, her empty hands, she did not pull. Away that night, as she lay in bed listening, the wind returned again and again, always with that same weight, that same whisper of fabric, that same sense that somewhere close, someone had finally chosen to stop moving, to settle, to share the same sky. And though the house remained still, and though her voice remained unused, and though the silence inside was still thick with years of solitude, the wind no longer came alone. And she, though she could not yet say the words, was no longer waiting without end. They did not arrive with fanfare, not with the noise of wagons, or the clatter of tools, or the laughter that usually comes with groups in motion. Instead, they appeared as if the wind had placed them there overnight, like seeds blown from afar off, land and gently rooted in the dry soil without ceremony or resistance. 8 tents emerging one by one beneath the flat sky as the woman watched from behind the warped glass of her only window. Her breath held not out of fear, but out of something. Deeper recognition, perhaps, or disbelief that company could come without warning, without invitation, without words. They moved with a rhythm unfamiliar to her, but not unsettling. Deliberate and calm, their hands folding canvas and driving stakes, not with urgency, but with memory. Like women who had done this before, many times, in many other forgotten places. No one spoke, not to her, not even to each other. But there was communication in their silence, a quiet choreography that built order out of stillness. They did not glance at the house, did not knock, did not gesture, yet they arranged their tents so that the flaps faced her window. A subtle act that spoke louder than any greeting might have, as though acknowledging the home without disturbing it, as though saying, "We see you," without demanding to be seen in return. The woman stayed at the window long after the sun had slipped below the horizon. Her shadow melted into the dim interior behind her, watching as the final tent was secured, its ropes tied with precision, its corners pressed smooth against the ground, and for the first time in decades, she found herself wondering about others, their reasons, their stories, their sleep. She did not light a lamp, did not open her door, but she lingered. And in the lingering, something old inside her shifted. Something dry cracked open like the crust of earth after long drought. The night settled slowly, with only the rustle of canvas and the quiet breath of women unfamiliar yet strangely expected. And though no word passed between them, a new language began to form between window and tent, between home and camp, between a woman who had forgotten the sound of her own voice and 8 others who chose to speak through arrangement, through attention, through presence. Outside, the wind curled through the silent tents and under the doorframes and between the broken steps of the porch, carrying no answers, only this simple message: You are no longer alone, and no one is asking you to speak to be heard. That night, without deciding to, without writing it down or saying it aloud, or even thinking it fully through, she placed the old blackened pot on the fire pit behind the house. The one she hadn't used in years. The one whose bottom bore the memory of 100 scorched dinners from a lifetime that no longer spoke to her. She filled it slowly with water, the motion unfamiliar and oddly gentle, as though touching something sacred rather than merely domestic. And when the flames took the wood and the pot began to whisper steam into the cooling desert air, she turned. Away, not expecting, not hoping, just continuing. Like someone who moves out of habit and lets the gesture carry its own meaning. The sky darkened, stars appeared, and the wind blew low against the dirt, curling around the boots she had not worn that day and pulling softly at her sleeves. And then she heard it, not footsteps, not voices, but presence, breath, the fabric of skirts brushing against each other, and she looked only with the edge of her eyes, not wanting to break the moment. As the women emerged from their tents one by one, each carrying something cradled in their hands, something small, something firm, something green, something orange, something pulled from a pouch or folded cloth or memory. And without a word, without nod or signal, they placed their offerings by the fire: a potato, a carrot, half an onion, a handful of lentils, herbs wrapped in twine, a clove of garlic still dusted with earth. No one asked what would be made. No. One questioned the flavor. No one counted or compared or corrected. Each gesture was enough, and she, without fully understanding why, took the knife, cleaned the food, dropped them into the boiling water with care. Not like a cook, but like a keeper of something quiet and necessary. The fire crackled, the steam thickened, and the women settled into a circle around it. Not sitting too close, not too far, like a constellation held loosely together by the magnetism of warmth and need. No stories were told, no names exchanged, yet something filled the air between them. A kind of silent grammar built from shared motion and the smell of simmering comfort. And the woman who had not eaten with another person in so long she had forgotten how not to ration silence, realized she did not feel watched, did not feel judged, only included, even if only by gesture, by breath, by bowl. When the soup was done, she poured the first portion and placed it gently on a stone near the center. And each woman came forward, not in order, but in rhythm, lifting the bowl with quiet gratitude, sipping slowly, heads bowed not in prayer, but in memory, in recognition of hunger and heat and the miracle of a meal made not from abundance, but from presence. And when she sat down at last and tasted the broth, she was surprised not by the flavor, which was humble, but by the warmth that filled her chest, not from the fire, but from the knowing that nothing had been spoken, and yet everything had been heard. That morning, when she stepped outside her door and the rising sun painted the dust in long strips of gold and shadow, she noticed something she hadn't seen the night before, not because it wasn't there, but because silence has its own way of speaking, and it rarely shouts. There, placed at the edge of her worn-out rug that barely held its threads anymore, were 8 pairs of shoes, none new, none identical, but all clean, positioned with a care that said more than words. Each faced her door, but not intrusively. There was no aggression in their placement, no suggestion of claim, only acknowledgement, like a soft breath before a sentence never said. Some had creased leather and cracked soles, others were patched cloth or hand-stitched hide, but none seemed lost or orphaned. They belonged quietly, without needing to explain how. She did not pick them up. She didn't even approach. She simply stood at the threshold of her silence, watching as the sun slowly touched each pair, lighting them like old relics set out for a ritual older than memory. In that moment, something shifted, not in the ground, not in the wind, but in her. For years, she had faced only the horizon, her back to the world. And now 8 pairs of shoes stood behind her, waiting without urgency, without expectation, like punctuation marks to a life she had stopped writing. She did not cry. She did not smile, but her breath caught for half a second, and that was enough to remind her of what it meant to be seen, not for what she had done or failed to do, but simply for still being here, for waking up again, for surviving another night with the windows open and the stove cold. She went inside, not hurried, not slow, and began her routine. Water in the kettle, beans in the pan, movements honed over years of repetition. She didn't open the door wide. She didn't call out, but she left it unlocked, and that in her world was the loudest yes she'd spoken in years. By mid-morning, the wind had shifted direction. It curled around the cabin, not in its usual aimless wandering, but with a new kind of purpose, as if carrying with it stories from the tents, scents of braided hair and dried herbs, the faintest hum of a lullaby not sung but remembered. And then, without sound, the shoes moved. Not by magic, not by wind, but by the hands that wore them. The women did not knock. They did not ask. One by one, they stepped onto the rug, their presence light but unmistakable, and removed their shoes again, placing them exactly as before, only this time inside. One rested her hand on the doorframe before entering. Another paused to fix a loose strap. They moved like they had done this before, in another time, another place, and perhaps they had. Or perhaps shared grief teaches the same choreography across generations. They didn't sit in chairs, there weren't enough anyway. Instead, they found places on the floor, against the walls, near the stove, forming a loose half-circle like. Women who knew space mattered more than shape. Still, no one spoke. Still, no names. Yet she did not feel invaded. Her solitude wasn't being stolen, it was being witnessed, gently, respectfully, as something sacred and cracked. One woman, the eldest perhaps, opened a small cloth bundle and began to mend a tear in her sleeve with a bone needle and black thread. Another pulled out a stick of charcoal and began sketching on a flat stone near the hearth, nothing elaborate. Just the curve of the mountain outside, a single line for the sky. Time did not move in minutes or hours anymore. It moved in breaths, in glances, in the slow heat rising from the kettle and the way the dust settled on the windowsill. And as the afternoon deepened and the light began to fall again into long orange streaks, the woman who had lived so long in stillness found herself sitting not alone, but among, part of not leader, not host, but witness, participant, flame tender. She reached for the broom without thinking and began to sweep. Not because it was dirty, not because anyone cared, but because when something sacred happens, you clear space around it. That evening, when the stars returned and the air cooled and the wind tucked itself into the seams of the walls like a cat curling into sleep, she looked at the shoes again, now inside, now familiar. Not gifts, not offerings, but affirmations. That the rug still mattered. That the edge could be crossed. That what was hers could be shared without losing its shape. That silence could be not only endured, but chosen. That the house, once turned only toward the dust, now faced something else, not noise, but life. That night, long after the sun had buried itself beneath the bones of the horizon and the desert wrapped itself in a silence only the stars dared interrupt, a sound rose that was not quite music and not quite memory, a thread of melody so soft. It could have been mistaken for the sound of air breathing through canvas or wind dragging its fingers through dry grass. But it was neither. It was a hum, slow and unsure at first, like someone remembering not a song but the feeling a song once gave. And it came from one of the tents, from a voice that had remained wordless for days, a voice that did not ask to be heard, but made itself known anyway, not in volume, but in truth. And the woman, alone in her house, sat up on the floor where she had made a bed from folded blankets and straw-stuffed linen, and held her breath, not because she feared what the hum meant, but because she knew what it was and had known it long before it ever reached her ears. It was not a melody she could name, yet every rise and fall felt like it belonged to something inside her, something ancient and neglected. A feeling not summoned but awakened, and her hands trembled slightly as she pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders, not from cold, but from that overwhelming ache of being called by something that didn't know her name but still knew where she was. The song did not grow louder, nor did it change, and yet with every passing moment, it seemed to carry more weight, like it was pulling meaning from the very stones and shadows around them, collecting old echoes and forgotten gestures into something whole. Outside, the wind shifted, not enough to make a sound, but enough to move a strand of hair across her face. And she didn't brush it away, she just listened, eyes closed now, and let the hum fill the quiet spaces in her chest that had never before been occupied by anything but endurance. She had lived through storms, through hunger, through weeks when even her own voice sounded foreign. But she had never lived through this, a sound that asked for nothing, yet gave her everything she didn't know she needed. And when the humming faded, not ending so much as retreating into stillness, she didn't speak, didn't move, just sat in the dark and knew that something in the world had shifted slightly. Not outside her home, but inside her. And that someone, out there in a canvas tent under a pale moon, had carried a song long enough to finally let it go. And without knowing who, the woman sent her silence in return, not as absence, but as answer. The mirror had hung there for decades, its frame carved from a tree no one remembered planting and polished by hands long turned to dust. Its glass dulled not by dirt, but by time itself, a surface more accustomed to shadows than faces. Yet on this morning it woke before she did, catching a shard of sun that slipped through the cracked shutter and stretched across the room like a hesitant hand. And when she sat up, rubbing the desert from her eyes, she saw not just herself in that weary glass, but the outlines of others behind her. Not spirits nor tricks of the light, but 8 silent figures reflected clearly, each one with hair unbrushed by the wind, eyes holding storms that had passed, mouths shaped like secrets and scars, standing without touching, but close enough that their breaths seemed to warm the same air. And for a moment, she didn't turn around, didn't move at all, because something about seeing them through the mirror, through that old, imperfect, truthful mirror felt more real than seeing them in the flesh. As if the glass knew how to strip people of pretense and history and simply show what remained underneath. And she remembered, in that stillness, the way her own face had changed over the years, how the angles had sharpened with solitude, how her jaw had set like stone from too many silences swallowed, how the soft beneath her eyes had faded as the nights lengthened without company. And yet now, next to hers, these faces did not judge, did not question, they only looked. And being looked at without being measured was something she hadn't known she needed, but now, as the silence thickened around them all, she realized that sometimes the presence of others doesn't break solitude, it redefines it, paints it in softer colors, allows it to breathe alongside new rhythms, and the mirror, which had once only served to remind her that she was still there, now served a second purpose, to remind her that she was no longer alone. And as the 8 women behind her slowly stepped forward, their reflections staying perfectly in sync, they each placed a small item, an earring, a ribbon, a lock of hair on the cracked wooden table before the glass, and though no words were spoken, the act was loud with meaning, a ceremony of acknowledgement, of shared understanding, of unspoken welcome, and she, still seated, felt tears threaten but not fall, felt her fingers twitch but not reach out, felt her heart adjust to the new shape the house had taken overnight. Not just a shelter, but now a witness to the beginnings of something unnamed. And as the light shifted, bouncing off the mirror and scattering across the room like glittering dust. She finally turned, not to speak, but to see them with her own eyes, and when she did, they smiled. Not because anything was funny, but because something old had been broken and something new had been born. And sometimes a smile is the only way the soul remembers how to exhale. The fire was not built to be warm, nor to cook, nor to drive away the desert's creeping chill that came each dusk without invitation. It was built to be seen, and so it stood in the center of the clearing, surrounded not by logs or benches, but by the dry, expectant air of something that remembered how to listen, and when it first flickered to life, it was with a gentleness not unlike breath, as if the flame had waited too long in silence and had forgotten how to roar. The woman who lit it did not sit near it, nor did she gesture or speak, but instead returned to her weather-beaten stool just inside the threshold of the house, whose walls had once held nothing but dust and the groaning sound of wind. And for a long while, nothing moved, nothing answered. And then, one by one, they began to emerge 8 women, wrapped not in blankets, but in a silence worn like armor, stepping barefoot across the cracked earth with a grace that neither asked for welcome nor assumed it, circling the fire in slow, reverent paces like planets drawn toward a forgotten sun, each finding her place not by direction, but by instinct. And as the circle formed, no one looked at another, no words were spoken, no instructions offered, and yet everything aligned, as if this fire had waited lifetimes for this precise arrangement of breathing bodies and burdened hearts. And the flames, fed by the still air, danced upward in soft pulses, casting shadows that did not frighten, but instead made the night feel inhabited. And from her spot at the doorway, the woman watched them not as a host or a leader, but as someone who had finally been joined in her long vigil. And though she made no motion to rise, her eyes flickered with the reflection of the circle, and her fingers, resting on her lap, curled slightly, as if holding something invisible and delicate. One of the 8 reached into her pocket and tossed a pinch of crushed sage into the fire, and it hissed softly, the smoke curling into a thin spiral that seemed to mark the beginning of something sacred but unnamed. And another, younger and barefoot, bent down and brushed the ground with her palm 3 times before sitting cross-legged where her hand had touched. And still, nothing was said, but everything felt answered, as if each gesture was a sentence in a language they all remembered, but had not spoken in years. And the wind, always a restless guest in the desert, slowed to a respectful hush, pressing gently against the backs of those gathered as though encouraging them to stay, to see this through. The woman inside the house closed her eyes, and for the first time in many winters, she felt something beyond the dull ache of solitude. She felt witnessed, not as a relic of survival, but as a piece of something enduring, something that could still draw others into its orbit. And the fire crackled in agreement, sending out a rhythm that was not quite music and not quite silence, a heartbeat of light that said without saying, "You are not alone, not tonight, and maybe not ever again." As the hours passed, the circle never broke, not for thirst, not for cold, not even when the moon was high and the stars blinked sleepily overhead. And in that unbroken shape, in that shared stillness, something passed between them, invisible and weightless but undeniable, a vow not made aloud, but sealed in the smoke and the steady glow of flame on skin. And when morning finally leaned over the edge of the horizon, spilling pale light across the clearing, the fire was still burning, smaller now, but proud. And the women, all 8 of them, remained exactly as they had come, not claimed, not changed, but connected, as if the dust itself had told them a story too old to repeat and too true to forget. The morning came not with fanfare, but with a hush, as if the desert itself had paused to listen to what would not be spoken. And in that gentle arrival of light, where golden rays brushed over weathered canvas and cracked clay, the silence remained. Not heavy, not hollow, but whole, complete in its own quiet authority. And the woman who had lived so long with only wind and dust stepped into it barefoot. Not to break it, but to join it, her feet finding their way through the sleeping edge. Of the camp were 8 tents, worn but steady, held within them the slow breathing of those who had arrived not to ask, not to change, but simply to be. And that was enough. More than she had ever expected, more than she had ever dared to admit she needed. And as she walked, the earth beneath her feet did not shift as it once had, did not resist her steps, but welcomed them like an old friend, as though the ground itself had waited for this soundless procession of bare skin on soil. In front of one tent, a pot still warm from last night's embers sat with a ladle resting quietly against its rim. The kind of domestic detail that once would have made her flinch too familiar. Too fragile, but now brought a kind of still comfort. A reminder that shared life was not a burden, but a possibility. And when she reached the center of the camp, where the ashes of the fire still smoldered softly, she sat not with ceremony, not with words, but with the slow, unhurried grace of someone who no longer feared being seen. And as she did, one by one, the other women emerged, their faces still softened by sleep. Their eyes not questioning, but affirming, not searching, but recognizing, and no one spoke. Because there was nothing left to ask, and nothing that had not already been answered. In the long, unspoken hours of firelight and stillness, of breath and presence, one of them handed her a piece of bread, not offered as a gift, not extended as a gesture of pity or welcome, but simply passed as if it had always belonged in her hands. And as she took it, the warmth of it lingered longer than expected, like the weight of memory or hope, and she bit into it slowly, feeling it anchor her in the now, in this camp that had once been impossible and was now simply hers. A child's laughter echoed softly from inside one of the tents, and she did not flinch, did not draw inward as she once might have, but let the sound move through her like wind through cloth, light and stirring and good. And in that moment, as the sun crested the low ridge and spilled fully into the valley, she closed her eyes not to shut the world out, but to let it in more deeply. And in that darkness she saw them all, not as intruders, not as saviors, but as the rest of the story she hadn't known was still being written. The missing lines in a song hummed without melody, the unnamed verses in a language of shared silence. And so she breathed in and out, and let the morning settle around her, not waiting for words, not needing them, because the silence between them, around them, within them, was finally enough.